All right, so many of my students have requested a tutorial on chemistry, so here you go. So the four main categories of molecules we're going to talk about are your carbs, your lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So for each of these categories, we're going to go over the subtypes, the structure, and then the function. So for carbohydrates, it's going to be made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And we have three main subtypes here: our monosaccharides, disaccharides, and our polysaccharides. Now just a reminder from class that mono means one, di two, and poly many. So the examples that you have to know for each: for monosaccharide, you need to know glucose; for disaccharide, sucrose and lactose; and polysaccharide, glycogen. And glycogen is going to be a key one when we talk about the blood glucose cycle. All of these have the same function, which is energy storage. For lipids, we have three categories as well. We have our phospholipids, our triglycerides, and cholesterol. You've probably heard of triglycerides and cholesterol before, but probably not in this depth. So the first one we're going to talk about is phospholipids. Now the name already tells you what's in it. So there's phospho, so phosphate, and lipids. So here you have a phosphate head and two fatty acid tails. The function here is that these become components of membranes. So when we move into the chemistry chapter, or rather the cell chapter, you're going to see that these phospholipids make up the bilayer of the membrane. And so for those of you coming out of high school biology, this will be a review for you. Triglycerides, again, the name tells you what it's made up of. Tri for three, and glycerides. So we have one glycerol and we have three fatty acid tails. Function here, very straightforward: energy storage. The third type of lipid we're talking about is cholesterol. Now for function here, I'm keeping it very simple. It just has a steroid structure. Now cholesterol has two main functions. One is that it stabilizes the cell membrane. The second one is that it can be used to create steroid hormones. This makes sense because it's linked back to its structure. So hormones here are going to be ones that we talk about in the endocrine system. That's your hormone system. So things like cortisol, which is our stress hormone, and testosterone and estrogen. So that's it for lipids. We're moving on to our next category, which is proteins. So for proteins, we have two main categories: structural and functional. Now they're going to have the same structure, but different examples that you have to know. So for structural, I want you to know collagen and keratin. And so in class, we talked about how collagen is very, very strong. So it makes up tendons and ligaments, the outsides of organs. It's really a protein fiber that we use throughout the body when we need a tissue to be strong but flexible. Keratin is a little bit different. We find it in our skin, and it's strong, but mainly it's waterproof. So that's why our skin is waterproof. For functional, we have a lot of different options, as we talked about in class. Things like membranes, membrane receptors, membrane channels. But the example I want you to know is enzymes. So these are all proteins. And so these enzymes will help us do different processes in the body. So again, both categories are made up of the same components, namely a chain of amino acids. And our structural proteins build cellular components. Our functional proteins will assist in cellular processes, whether that's as a channel, a receptor, or an enzyme. So our last category is nucleic acids. So in this category, we're going to have three different types: our DNA, our RNA, and our ATP. Now, DNA and RNA you've probably heard of before. ATP you probably haven't heard of before unless you've done high school bio recently. So with DNA, for structure here, it is made up of deoxyribose, So that's the kind of sugar that we have. And we have a nucleotide. Now for DNA, our options are A, C, G, and T. This is going to be a little bit different than RNA. The DNA has the T component to it, the RNA doesn't. So this is adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine, where ribose has the uracil instead of the thymine. The function of DNA, we talked about this in class, is that it really is the instruction manual for the cell and for the entire body. So we can go to the DNA to find instructions on how to build any protein in the body at any time. The trick with this is that all of those instructions stay within the nucleus of the cell at all times. So we need to have a copy of the instructions that we can take out of the nucleus to make our protein. And that's where RNA comes in. So again, for structure, the difference here is that it's ribose sugar instead of deoxyribose. We still have nucleotides, except we have the uracil instead of the thymine. Function here is that this is the working copy of instructions. So it's like there's a library book, that's the DNA. We can't take it out of the library, so we take a photocopy of it, and we can take that with us out of the library to go and build whatever we want to build. And we'll go through this process quite a few times when we hit the cellular chapter, which is coming up next. Our last one for our nucleic acids is adenosine triphosphate. Now our adenosine is our amino acid, and it's attached to 3 phosphate groups. So that's why it's tri, right? So tri for 3. So this is the energy molecule in the cell. So when the cell needs energy to get something done, it can break off a phosphate group. When it breaks off the connection between the phosphate groups, energy is released. And so it releases energy, the cell can use it to do something, and then we can recycle that by taking a phosphate and smacking it back on there. So we would go back to ATP. And again, this is a process we'll see multiple times. So that's all of the chemistry in a nutshell. So remember that when you're studying this, try to think of it in layers, right? So this very first section, know just the subtypes: carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. The most important thing for me always is going to be function. So if you remember the function of each, that's great. This also means that you'll have to know the subtypes for these guys. The least important part for me is structure. So all of this whole layer here for structure, save that to the end if you're finding this challenging. The only exception to that would be for the carbs, because we will be using this information throughout the whole course. So this one for structure, you do need to know. And that's it. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you in class.